must be open to the falsification of your theory. In politics, you must be open to the democratic replacing of your regime. And he says it's the same philosophy.
I'm not going to get very far with that.
Both have got to be revised in the light of evidence and the will of the people. I met Popper, I met him in 1984. Really? Yeah. Especially towards his wife. Perhaps the wife was a friend. She deserved it.
Apparently she typed all his books for him.
Yeah. That's quite enough. Thank you, Nikolai.
She made some mistakes.
It is 5 past.
Typing errors, that's okay.
Okay. So I know some of you weren't here last time, so I'll summarise what I said then very briefly, and then I'll go on to the subject of today's lecture, which is beauty. So in the introductory lecture last week, I defined aesthetics, which is the subject of the whole 8 lectures which we're doing. And I offered the definition that aesthetics is the philosophy of beauty and the philosophy of art. And I raised the question last week, why should we study these two things together? It seems that things can be beautiful without being art. An example is on the wall behind me. That's Ruskin's view up north. You can go and see. He said of it, it's the most beautiful view in England and therefore the world. So it seems things can be beautiful without being art, because it's not art, it's nature. Things can be works of art without being beautiful. I gave the examples of Casso's Guernica and of Bela Bartok's The Miraculous Mandarin. So you might think that we could study these two areas separately. Nonetheless, there's a tradition in philosophy called aesthetics where we study them together. To decide whether that's a good idea, whether it's reasonable to do so, I suggested that we might want to ask two further questions. What is beauty and what is art? And possibly a third question, what's the relationship between the two? And I said a small amount on each of these questions last week. Regarding art, I really just spoke about whether our concept of art today, or the fine arts, the arts, is the same as the one they had in the prior to the 18th century. Many people think that this is a relatively recent idea, that painting, poetry, sculpture, architecture, etc. form a unified area of activity which is distinct in some way from carpentry or tanning or whatever. Although I gave some reasons to suggest that perhaps that's not clearly the case, and maybe ancient and medieval thinkers had something like our idea of art, or at least something like our attitude to the things we consider fine art. Regarding beauty, I said that, I suggested that there might be two notions of beauty, which are important to keep distinct when thinking about aesthetics. A very broad notion where when we say something's beautiful, we just mean overall the way it looks or the way it appears is pleasing to us. And then a more narrow view on which we mean, by saying something's beautiful, that it's light and bright and harmonious. So on the former view, I suggested, things like a vast desert landscape or a storming sea would be beautiful because we enjoy the way they look. But on the latter view, these things aren't light or bright or harmonious necessarily, and so they're not beautiful in that narrower sense. It might be useful to add here that the term aesthetics, having been deployed in the 18th century as a name for philosophical inquiry into beauty and the arts, then came to be used and is used now really to describe anything pertaining to beauty in this broad sense, or indeed to its opposite, or things that contribute to those. So things like being perhaps graceful or dainty or ugly are described sometimes as aesthetic concepts or as aesthetic properties. Today, though, we're just going to look at one of the questions that I've listed, the question, what is beauty? It'll take until lecture 4 to get onto what is art. Next week will be what is the sublime, which is another, what you might call another aesthetic concept of property, perhaps more appropriate to desert landscapes and that kind of thing. So we're going to look more closely at how some philosophers have reacted to the concept of beauty, or to the idea of beauty. I'm just going to go through 4 accounts, or at least I'm going to try to go through 4 accounts. That might be a bit ambitious, so we might fail to go through them, and I might do a lot of damage to them along the way as well, but we'll see how it goes. So I'm going to start with what's sometimes called the compositional account. This is the account in which beauty is a matter of the way the parts of the things are arranged in relation to one another, roughly speaking. Very ancient notion, allegedly at least, and probably actually. I'm going to talk about Plato's account of beauty, which is part of his wider theory of metaphysics, his theory of the forms, which I'll summarize. Beauty turns out to be one of the forms, as most things do for Plato, except the things that aren't. Then we'll talk about what I'll describe as a British empiricist account of beauty, because it's mainly endorsed by British empiricists writing in about the 18th century, according to which beauty is a matter of something experiential, usually pleasure. A beautiful object is, roughly speaking, one whose appearance is enjoyable to you, a bit like I've defined beauty in a broad sense, and perhaps in doing that I beg the question a bit. Although it's not necessarily the case that these accounts are mutually incompatible. It might be that one captures the essence of beauty or says something more interesting about it, which is true, whilst others are nonetheless true. Finally, I'll try to describe Immanuel Kant's account of beauty in his 1790 work, The Critique of Judgment. That's been an extremely influential and important discussion in the history of aesthetics. A lot of Kant's ideas are adopted by later thinkers who aren't necessarily Kantians generally about beauty. It's also, to some degree, embedded in Kant's broader metaphysics and epistemology, which is notoriously complicated and difficult. So I'll try to bring out the main points he has about beauty, and say something about their relation to his other work without going through the whole critique of pure reason, critique of practical reason, and so forth. So we're starting with the compositional account. This is account 1. And this, it's often said, is the account of beauty which is most dominant right up from ancient times to the beginning of the 18th century, when aesthetics as a philosophical discipline takes root, at least in the form we know it today. And on the compositional account, beauty is a matter of, well, as I've said, harmonious composition, and in particular, mathematical proportion. So this is often said to be a notion of beauty which is exemplified very well by Greek and Roman architecture. Oh, is that not the one? There we go. There we go. So this is the Temple of Concordia at Agrigento in Italy. And you can see that it's a standard kind of a Doric school, as it's known, classical temple. It's quite proportionate, I suppose. The triglyphs are all above the columns. The triangular shape is roughly as wide as the bottom. It doesn't have any arches or towers sticking out of the side. So there's a pretty intuitive way in which you can understand why you might think, well, this is beautiful, and it's harmonious in its proportions. Perhaps the two are related. So although this is often said to be the dominant account of beauty from ancient times onwards, the compositional account, it's not that easy to find ancient philosophers endorsing it. Aristotle has a few lines where he does seem to give this kind of account. In the Poetics, he says, "To be beautiful, a living creature and every whole made up of parts must present a certain order in its arrangement of parts. Sounds like a compositional account. In the metaphysics as well, he says the chief forms of beauty are order, symmetry, and definiteness, which the mathematical sciences demonstrate in a special degree. Also, it seems like the compositional account. Thomas Aquinas has a more sophisticated account than that given in these couple of quotations from Aristotle, but he also emphasizes proportion or consonance. There's quite a good example of this understanding of beauty in a work on classical architecture, of the sort behind me, by the ancient architect Vitruvius. So he says, at one point in his work, De Architectura, architecture consists of order, which in Greek is called taxis, and arrangement, which the Greeks called diathesis, and proportion, symmetry, decor, and distribution, which the Greeks call oikonomia. And he goes on to explain that order is balanced adjustment of the details of the work, proportion implies graceful semblance, the suitable display of details in their context. He goes on to talk about symmetry, correspondence. Symmetry also involves the appropriate harmony rising out of the details of the work, correspondence of detail to the design as a whole. And he gives examples from animals and from nature as to how you can employ this kind of notion of beauty. This is an illustration of Vitruvius's theory. It's from the contemporary classical architect Thomas Gordon Smith has a book. I think it's actually an edition of Vitruvius's De Architectura with illustrations. So this has been done supposedly in accordance with Vitruvius's descriptions of how a proportion ought to be employed to create a beautiful building, and it's obviously a harmonious building and quite beautiful. This idea, the compositional account, the idea that beauty can be understood as a matter of harmonious parts corresponding to one another, in particular mathematical proportions, has captured the imagination of quite a lot of people. And in particular the idea that it might be reducible to something quite simple, such as the golden ratio, which you presumably come across before. If you haven't, I have a demonstration. This is the golden ratio. The point here is that the line of length A plus B has the same ratio to A as A has to B, right? And you can repeat this segmentation like that. It's alleged, well, Pythagoras, the Greek said, discovered this proportion, and it's alleged to appear very frequently in objects which we judge beautiful, and so sometimes it's suggested that beauty is reducible or in some way follows from the instantiation of the golden section or golden ratio. It's alleged to appear in nature a lot. This is a picture of a hurricane. I don't know which hurricane, which appears online, but the picture was going around a great deal on Facebook and other social media a year or two ago. This is called a Fibonacci spiral, which is made out of the ratio, as you can see, very much like the rectangles I showed you earlier. You can also see it. This is the golden ratio used in classical architecture. I think that's quite compelling. This is the Parthenon, of course, the very famous temple in Athens, and you can really see how the golden ratio seems to be followed there in the proportion of the parts to one another. This is Leonardo's Last Supper, perhaps slightly more tendentious, and this is the Mona Lisa, at which stage it starts to become a little bit implausible. I'm not sure what's meant to be non-arbitrary about it starting here. In any case, ends with her nose. So the golden ratio is quite an exciting and fun idea. It's also quite a popular tattoo if you look up on Google Images, you'll find. but at least if you investigate it, there does seem to be some tendency to see golden ratios where one wants to see golden ratios, and this is the case supposedly in the sciences as well. There are articles suggesting that it's overemphasized a bit. So I think the idea that even the kind of beauty that's involved in harmonious composition of parts, it's implausible that it could be reduced to something as simple as the golden ratio. Nonetheless, the general idea that beauty is a matter of harmony, proportion, the compositional account, does have some popularity, at least just before aesthetics kicks off again in the 18th century, amongst the philosophers who we usually think of as the continental rationalists, people like Descartes and his followers. So I've got a quotation here. This is from Jean Tarasson's 1715 dissertation on Homer's Iliad. He says in 1715, the way to think about a literary problem is that pointed out by Descartes for problems of physical science. A critic who tries any other way is not worthy to be living in the present century. There's nothing better than mathematics as a propedeutic for literary criticism. Similarly, a year before this actually, in 1714, Leibniz, in the Principles of Nature and Grace based on reason, says about music, music that we hear can charm us even though its beauty consists only in relations among numbers, and in the way beats or vibrations or the sounding body return to the same frequency at certain intervals. We are not aware of the numbers of these beats, but the soul counts them all the same. Our pleasure in the proportion of things we see are the same kind, and those that other senses produce will come down to something similar, even though we couldn't explain them so straightforwardly. So, a great deal of confidence in Leibniz, who doesn't have any major work in aesthetics, but seems to be very confident that beauty is about mathematics, that the compositional account, something like it, will work. There's also the British philosopher Francis Hutcheson. He's really working in more the empiricist tradition, but he says something quite similar. The figure that excites in us the ideas of beauty seem to be those in which there is uniformity amidst variety. What we call beautiful in objects, to speak in the mathematical style, seems to be in the compound ratio of uniformity and variety. So there are other aspects to Hutcheson's aesthetics, well, other aspects to all of these people's thought, but there seems to be some popularity, perhaps more so in the 17th century and very early 18th century than there was in ancient times. That might be false, there might be more if you look hard enough. So the compositional account seems to be quite compelling, at least, well, not perhaps for the Mona Lisa, but for things like classical architecture. It would be pretty implausible to claim that the beauty of the Parthenon has nothing to do with the harmonious proportion of parts. Nonetheless, it's not very likely that we're going to be able to account for all beauty in this way. So if when we ask the question, what is beauty, we're looking for necessary and sufficient conditions, we're looking for a list of conditions which will tell us when anything's beautiful, such that anything that's beautiful must have them and anything that has them is beautiful. The compositional account probably isn't going to provide us that. A classic criticism of it is given by the great Neoplatonist philosopher Plotinus. He says in the Aeneads, published around 270 AD, almost everyone declares that invisible things, as indeed in all else, universally, the beautiful thing is essentially symmetrical, patterned. But think what this means. Only a compound can be beautiful. All the loveliness of colour, and even the light of the sun, being devoid of parts, and so not beautiful by symmetry, must be ruled out from the realm of beauty. And how comes gold to be a beautiful thing? And lightning by night, and the stars which are so fair. In sounds, also, the simple must be prescribed, though often, in a whole noble composition, each several tone is delicious in itself. I've got a picture. There's the evening star, beautiful despite lacking parts, and therefore incapable of being beautiful in virtue of the composition of those parts. I give the example of the evening star in particular because St. Basil of Caesarea, in his second homily, heavily plagiarizes Plotinus's discussion there, says basically the same thing, no reference, but gives the example of the evening star in particular as a counterexample to the compositional account of beauty. If the evening star is beautiful, and if it's not beautiful because of its compositional features, then the compositional account can't give necessary and sufficient conditions for beauty because this lacks them and is beautiful, so they can't be necessary. They're not necessary and sufficient. A further criticism appears in the 18th century of this account. A good work for that is Edmund Burke's 1757 philosophical inquiry into the origin of the ideas of the beautiful and the sublime, which I'll be talking about a little more today and more next week as well. So I'll move on to Plato's account of beauty. I mean, the compositional account is, if you ignore the golden ratio stuff, quite a sober account of what beauty amounts to. It's really just an objective feature of objects out there, mathematical proportions to one another. Plato's account is at the other end of the spectrum in this regard, being heavily metaphysical and in some huge respects very fanciful account. Plato actually has only one dialogue which is specifically on the subject of what beauty is, what is beauty, to Kalon, and that's the Hippias Major. If that is even a dialogue of Plato's, it was widely thought to have been written by someone else until relatively recently, in the second half of the 20th century, mainly thought to have been by him. That dialogue is what's called a Socratic dialogue, one of the early ones where Socrates asks a question of the form, what is X, and discusses it with an interlocutor, and they come to no conclusion about the answer, rather they end in aporia. So although it's a very nice dialogue to read, it has a nice literary qualities, and it's got some interesting examples as to what beauty is. For instance, the beautiful is a beautiful girl, that's the first one, or the beautiful is gold, because anything you add gold to becomes beautiful. It's not been very influential in aesthetics. Plato's influential thought in aesthetics doesn't come until what's usually considered the middle period of Plato's writing, where you no longer have dialogues with the standard Socratic dialogue form, where a short discussion of a what is X question ends in confusion and aporia, but you rather get much longer discussions with a lot of metaphysical content, and some people think much more of Plato's own thought, rather than merely a depiction of the way Socrates used to philosophize. And it's necessary, in order to understand what Plato says about beauty in his middle period, as it's known. The word middle is applied there because people think this came later than the Socratic dialogues, but previous to another group of dialogues which are pretty well known to be the last he wrote. This is actually debated again among scholars, although it's quite a widely endorsed view. In order to understand what Plato says about beauty in the middle dialogues, it's necessary to have some idea of his theory of forms, which most, if not all of you, will have come across before, but I'll just summarize it. The correct interpretation of this theory is controversial, like most things in philosophical exegesis. But the basic idea is that Plato notices that the same predicate often applies to many things. For example, many people are virtuous. Well, that might be false, but it could be true at least, that many people are virtuous. And from that it would seem to follow, at least Plato thinks, that there's something all of these people must have, or something that must be true of all of them. something because of which they're all virtuous, the same on each occasion. However, he also thinks that the people you meet usually are only very imperfectly virtuous. They don't seem to really get it. We seem to have an idea of various ways in which they could improve. On the other hand, Plato thinks that virtue itself, the thing that they all share, the property or quality or whatever it is, couldn't be imperfectly virtuous. Virtue itself is virtue, so how could it be less than perfectly virtuous? Lots of philosophers would think that's very odd reasoning, but Plato does seem to make use of it. And so he concludes from this kind of argument that virtue itself is a thing distinct from all individual instances of virtue. It's what's called a form, sometimes a transcendental form, and that other people are virtuous only because they, to some degree, instantiate this form. And so if that's the case, the existence of this form is supposed to explain why it is many people can have the same thing true of them or have the same thing in them. And it's also meant to explain why, when we meet a virtuous person, despite having never met anyone better perhaps, we still are able to judge that they're not perfectly virtuous. A final element of this theory, a very important element, is that because, or at least ostensibly, because we're able to judge that a person isn't perfectly virtuous simply by meeting them and without having compared them with lots of more virtuous people, Plato supposes that we must already have the idea of virtue before we ever judge a person virtuous. And the same for other concepts. In the Phaedo, where this argument actually appears, he's talking about the concept of equality. He says, well, we must already have the idea of equality, because when we see things which are equal to one another, he gives the example of equal sticks or equal stones, it seems to mean equal in size, we are able to judge that they're not equal, despite the fact we've never seen something equal. And so from this, Plato concludes, in what one commentator called the wildest of his metaphysical flights, we must have had this idea of virtue before we were born, because at any time after we were born, we're able to judge that sticks and stones are equal, that people are virtuous. So there doesn't seem to be any appropriate time for us to have gained this knowledge, so we must have already had it. And so Plato's overall picture is one according to which the soul existed prior to this life, apprehended the forms, virtue, things as they are in themselves, and then when it exists in this world and sees individual virtuous people or equal sticks and stones, it has that idea and is thereby able to judge them equal, virtuous, or whatever. So hopefully that's quite familiar. If it's not, it's going to seem extraordinarily foreign. Plato goes on to make use of this theory in his dialogue, The Symposium. And it's here, I think the only form referred to in the Symposium is beauty. Certainly it's a form referred to in the Symposium. So we're told in this dialogue that beauty is like virtue and these other things, really a transcendental form, one which we knew in a previous life, are able to understand because of that in this life. I've got a picture, because that's quite heavy. There you go. Oh, I had one of Plato too, but never mind. This is Plato's Symposium by the 19th century German artist Feuerbach. This is Alcibiades arriving drunk and Agathon in the middle, welcoming everyone. So the Symposium is actually a discussion of love. But at one stage, when Socrates is speaking and giving his extended account of love, he starts talking about what beauty is, partly because he seems to think our idea of beauty is connected to love, and he reports what a priestess named Diotima says to him about it. And it's here you get his account of beauty as a form. Diotima's suggestion is that first, by appreciating physical beauty of individual people, one can sort of move by steps to more and more general and abstract instances of beauty, end up apprehending the beautiful itself, the form of beauty, and for that reason, in some way, draw close to the divine. So she says, a person must use the beauties of the earth as steps along which he mounts upwards for the sake of that other beauty, going from one to two, from two to all fair forms, and from fair forms to fair actions, and from fair actions to fair notions, until from fair notions he arrives at the notion of absolute beauty, and at last knows what the essence of beauty is. In that communion only, beholding beauty with the eyes of the mind, he will be enabled to bring forth not images of beauty, but realities, to become the friend of God and be immortal, if mortal man may. So I said it was more fanciful than the compositional account in some respects. Plato says elsewhere that beauty isn't a special form, it's not higher than the others in some way or more important, but that it is the only one that is in some sense visible in this world. In the Phaedrus, Plato says, if wisdom were visible, if we could see it here, then it would be just as beautiful as beauty. It would shine as brightly, or something like that. But beauty at least has a special place amongst the forms in that dialogue, for being the only one which we apprehend here in some sense. And so it's as close as we can get, perhaps, to an experience of the world as it truly is, or even of the divine. The translation I'm using there, by the way, is from the old master of Balliol, Benjamin Jowett's translations of Plato's Dialogues, which is not a scholarly, well, it's not an edition used by scholars now, although it's a very nicely produced one, so worth using in this context. So the Neoplatonists, or well, many people have followed Plato's account of beauty, despite the fact that it might seem very foreign at first. Certainly the Neoplatonists adopted to some degree. There's an interesting passage where Plotinus, actually, who I quoted criticizing the compositional account earlier, seems to attempt a combination of the two. This is also in the Aeneas, a very, very close section. He says, we hold that all loveliness in this world comes by communion in ideal form, all shapelessness, whose kind admits of pattern and form, as long as it remains outside of reason and idea, is ugly, from that very isolation from the divine thought. And this is the absolute ugly. An ugly thing is something that has not been entirely mastered by pattern, that is, by reason, and matter not yielding at all points and in all respects to ideal form. And he goes on to talk about how beauty is a matter somehow of being harmonious because of a relation to ideal forms. It's worth noting this simply because the accounts of beauty you find historically might be taken intuitively to be competing accounts because they differ from one another in emphasis. But actually a lot of the time these historical accounts might be compatible with one another. There's no reason why things which instantiate the beautiful, the form, shouldn't also be things that exhibit harmonious proportion of parts. Perhaps one is a necessary prerequisite for the other, in which case these accounts would turn out to be extensionally equivalent. So anyway, Plato's account of beauty continues to have a huge influence, not only amongst philosophers, but also amongst artists right into the modern age. In Wordsworth's poem, Intimations on Immortality, he offers a Platonic view of the universe. He says, our birth is but a sleep and a forgetting. The soul that rises in us, our life's star, hath had elsewhere its setting, and cometh from afar. Not in entire forgetfulness, and not in utter nakedness, but trailing clouds of glory do we come from God who is our home. It's a very lovely bit of poetry. and other Romantic poets, especially, and people in the Romantic movement, have expressed sympathy for the Platonic idea. I'll see how much of the empiricist view on Kant I can get through. So, back in the 18th century, and back to a more sober view of beauty, we have a discussion arising. Well, it might be worth saying, I'm sure many of you, or most of you, are aware that usually philosophers in the 18th century are divided into, 17th and early 18th, divided into rationalists and empiricists. Rationalists being continental philosophers, usually, supposedly, the canonical names being Descartes, Leibniz, and Spinoza. Empiricists being supposedly mainly British philosophers, the canonical names being Hobbes, Locke, Berkeley, and Hume. Often Hobbes is left out, actually. And the idea of this division, which is often attributed to Kant, although perhaps it already existed, it is that empiricist philosophers emphasize in some way experience as a source of knowledge. Rationalist philosophers emphasize reason as a source of knowledge. One interpretation is to say that empiricists think that there is no a priori metaphysical knowledge, and that rationalists think there is a priori metaphysical knowledge. Both seem to agree there might be some knowledge from experience. That's all very controversial. A lot of people think that the distinction doesn't really apply. But it's at least useful to be aware of these trends, because whether there's a strict distinction in the views of these philosophers or not, there's certainly trends amongst them. So, where the compositional account was popular in the 18th century, primarily amongst rationalist philosophers, it seems, on the continent, people like Leibniz and Tarascon, the empiricist, well, what I'm calling the empiricist account, I'm calling by that name because it's endorsed by philosophers in the British empiricist tradition, who seem to be in that tradition. And on this account, beauty is not a matter of an objective proportional harmony in objects out there. It's rather a matter of what happens subjectively to us in experience. The main idea being beautiful objects are those which afford us pleasure, or pleasurable experiences, or some kind of pleasurable passion or emotion. There is actually in the not particularly influential dialogue of Plato, the Hippias Major, an anticipation of this view. The very last account of beauty discussed there, offered as a proposal of Socrates, is that beauty is that which is pleasant through sight or hearing, which sounds a lot like the kind of things these empiricist philosophers say, although it's not a view endorsed in that dialogue, it's merely discussed. Hume, I think I've got a picture of Hume and Burke, yes, there they are. Both snappy dresses, but I think Hume is probably the more beautiful looking there of the two. Hume says in his treatise of human nature, 1739 to 1740 work, beauty is such an order and construction of parts, sounds a bit like the compositional account, either by the primary constitution of our nature, by custom, or by caprice, that is fitted to give pleasure and satisfaction to the soul. Pleasure and pain, therefore, are not only necessary attendants of beauty and deformity, but constitute their very essence. You know, there's something of the compositional account there, but his emphasis is certainly on pleasure, beautiful things, things that give us pleasure through their appearance, it seems. Similarly, Edmund Burke, who I've mentioned several times now in his Philosophical Inquiry, his 1757 work, says, or defines beauty as that quality or those qualities in bodies by which they cause love or some passion similar to it. So there it speaks of love and other passions. It seems to me it's a similar account to Hume's, and In fact, well, his thought on this is commensurate with Hume's in various other respects. There's a slight ambiguity in these views as to whether beauty is the sensation or experience itself that's afforded for us, whether the thing that's beautiful is the experience itself, or whether it's the object that causes that experience. So in the Hume quotation I gave, it seems to lean towards the view that it's the object that's beautiful, and beautiful objects just provide these experiences of pleasure. But Hume also speaks elsewhere in the same work about sentiments of beauty, or the experiences being beautiful. And it might be appropriate in this context to speak like Locke does about things such as colour. John Locke says, really it's the secondary quality is the thing in the mind, and it's really that that's red or blue or whatever. But we can speak with the vulgar about an object out there being red or blue or whatever. Likewise, you might think you could say that really it's your experience of the painting or the landscape which is beautiful, but we can also speak as though it were the landscape or the painting itself. Another thing often said of these kind of accounts of beauty is that they seem frequently to make it a very arbitrary matter whether or not something is beautiful. So it seems that if things are beautiful just because they afford pleasure by experiencing them, then when I say something's beautiful, all I'm really saying is that I like it. Or I might not even be saying I like it, I might just be expressing my liking for it. Like exclaiming yum when eating something. So 18th century advocates of what I'm calling an empiricist account of beauty tend to resist this conclusion by appealing to two things. On the one hand, to the universality, the alleged universality of human nature, and on the other hand, to our ability to improve our ability to make sensory discriminations, to notice smudges of paint better and so forth. The idea is that because everyone's nature is the same, human nature is universal in some way, it should be the case that everyone who approaches things without any prejudice and with a sufficient degree of attention to detail will find the same things beautiful. There's a very well-known essay by Hume on this, which came out in 1757, called On the Standard of Taste, where he says, if in sound state of the organ there be an entire or a considerable uniformity of sentiment among men, we may thence derive an idea of perfect beauty, in like manner as the appearance of objects in daylight to the eye of a man in health is denominated their true and real colour, even while colour is allowed to be merely a phantasm of the senses. The idea, two healthy, perfectly able-bodied people will see the same colours in things, even though colours only exist in the mind, according to Locke and according to Hume, other people in the same empiricist tradition. Edmund Burke actually edits his work on this and adds a section on taste, which is very, very similar to what Hume says in that essay. It comes in the second edition of his work on this. So, although Hume's On the Standard of Taste and Burke's inquiry into the origin of beauty in the sublime come out in the same year, it looks as though Burke copies Hume in that respect. Later on, though, British empiricists, or people still writing in the same tradition, tend to be less interested in resisting this idea that beauty is really just an arbitrary thing, a matter of how you experience things. So an important example of this, or a well-known example, is in A.J. Ayer's classic 1936 work, Language, Truth and Logic, which is a very wide-ranging philosophical book, but it mentions aesthetics in that. And he says, in that work, such aesthetic words as beautiful and hideous are employed not to make statements of fact, but simply to express certain feelings and evoke a certain response. That there is no sense attributing objective validity to aesthetic judgments, and no possibility of arguing about about questions of value in aesthetics. So that, I mean, I think in the 18th century, sometimes this kind of view is attributed to Hume and to other earlier thinkers. However, it's a controversial matter, and it might have seemed very counterintuitive in the 18th century to say that a judgment of beauty expressed uttering a sentence, "this is beautiful," is really just an exclamation of praise or an instance of applause. This, in Eyre's version of it, this is the same view as he takes in ethics, and it's known as emotivism, the idea that ethical statements or statements of value are really just expressions of emotion. Of course, you could allow that these are descriptions while still leaving beauty as an arbitrary thing, because you could say, well, it's a description of my own personal sentiment, which doesn't rely on a universal human nature or anything like that, and therefore leaves no guarantee for people's judgments of beauty to be the same in different cases. You might also think that's backed up by empirical evidence, because people don't always judge the same things to be beautiful, or you might follow Hume in trying to get around that by appealing to different degrees of capability in making discriminations amongst things. I was going to go on and say something about Kant, but I think that's an awful lot of information to take on in one go, and as I said at the beginning, it was probably a bit ambitious to try to do all four of these. So what I think I shall do, as it's already 5 to 4, is leave it at those three theories for this week. The compositional account, beauty is harmony of parts; the Platonic account, it's a transcendental form; and the empiricist account, it's a thing that affords pleasure, or perhaps a pleasurable experience. And next week, I'll introduce Kant's account and see if I can fit that with the much more exciting topic of the sublime. Partly more exciting because there's less I have to say about it, and so there can be more pictures and so forth. But that will be. Oh, there's Kant anyway. Even more dashing, I feel.